Now, the costumes are very important because it was a very colorful period, particularly of the underworld. And I think we have many records of what the upper classes and what the middle classes wore, but only few of the lower classes in the criminal world or the underworld.
Like any period film, the first stage is looking at the actual period, looking at things from the real period. So that was from 1840 to 1860. And you look at paintings from the period, but luckily for us with this, the daguerreotype had been invented, so we had photography to look at and looked at lots and lots of photographs. Also, Marty's company had already done like years worth of research, so I had a good start. They sent me a whole package and a lot of reading material, a lot of stuff to look at, so I had a good start, and that's where I began.
Designers tend to be very faithful to the historical aspect of costumes. She manages to do both. She manages to be faithful to the historical side and at the same time give it the flair that it needs. And that is her genius.
A lot of what we've done isn't strictly historically correct. I mean, we went through various stages and it does end up getting fairly stylized as well, although all being based with historical accuracy. I then taken it a few steps further.
Sandy came up with different ideas, a certain kind of hat, a certain way of walking, the shirt tails. We sort of elaborated on the shirts being outside the pants, making them longer than they would have been in reality. So that we've heightened the fantasy of the place.
I don't start with a drawing and then say, let's find the fabric that will work for this costume and this is the shape I want. I start with the fabrics. So that's probably the most important thing to me, is to be surrounded by fabrics that I like and inspire me, and that's usually where it starts. And the drawings are something I do quite a long way down the line. I mean, I do them, and I do little scribble drawings for the people making the costumes, which are more diagrams.
I had worked with Sandy on a number of occasions before Michael Collins, Rob Roy, and so I know the way she works, and I know she's an extraordinary talent. I felt that this coat they made for me, this huge, big, long coat, I felt should be on my character at all times. I think he'd be naked without it. Anytime he left his warren, this coat would be on. Almost like an armor, and it designated who he was, even from a distance. If you saw that coat, you'd know who the character was.
In a period film like this, a designer has a far greater responsibility in some ways. Also, the collaboration that they can have with each individual actor it's necessary, but at the same time, they have to take a lot of that responsibility themselves. They can't go out shopping with you.
Marty had quite strong ideas of how he saw Bill the Butcher, and he wanted him as a dandy, sort of showing off, really, sartorially, showing off his wealth in his clothing. So I started coming up with a few ideas and met Daniel, who initially had different ideas about where his character was coming from. But again, we tried on some shapes that we come up with, and it worked.
I'd never really imagined myself, Bill, or the natives to have been such peacocks. But from the moment that I began to try these things that she'd invented, they seemed quite right and wonderful.
Bill's outfits with all these different plaids and color just sort of clashing together, and everything was so rich.
We sort of developed a look with Daniel which kind of accentuated his longness, and he's very lean. And we accentuated that by making everything fairly tight-fitting and sort of very long, narrow trousers. And that's how he starts the movie looking kind of strange, actually, quite spidery. So the first time we see him, he's dressed for battle, for the opening battle sequence, which is a bit of a strange look. I mean, there is the full-length coat, which has always been in the script, so I know I had to do that. And that was actually one of the first things we made.
Then they have to become clothes. I mean, that's the tough thing. With something as extreme as that, it takes a little more time to get used to it.
Yeah, the women were the most difficult to do to begin with, because you look at pictures of Victorian women and it's what everyone knows a Victorian woman looks like, with heavily corseted, huge crinolines if they're rich, full length, fairly staid looking, and we had to think, how could we make the women of this made-up world go with the men? Because Marty wanted girls in the gangs as well. So I wanted to make them look a little tougher, and started again looking through reference and found some images of women who actually wore trousers underneath their skirts, and they were a group of women in the 1850s, I think, who were called dress reformers, and they were sort of like, early day feminists. And they were cutting up their long dresses, making the bottom bits into trousers and wearing them underneath their skirts. And we sort of used that. I used that as inspiration.
My character, she wasn't formal. You know, we think also of women being corseted up and these big, huge, billowing skirts that weighed 30, 40 pounds. Sandy's, she just took that all away from the 5 Point. She said, that doesn't exist here. Women don't have the money for that. And you think about it, you go, oh yeah, women wouldn't have the money for it, to build a complete structure around their body.
There is a range within this film because apart from things like the dead rabbits, the Native Americans, we've got people who live in the brewery who are slum dwellers, like really, really low, raggy looking people. We've got politicians and smart people who, along the lines of Boss Tui, but then we also had things like the Chinese pagoda scene with Chinese opera, so that went completely off on another tangent. We had to do costumes for the Bowery Theatre for the play, Uncle Tom's Cabin, so there's been a huge range actually. One of the great things about working with Marty is that he understands clothes and costumes and loves clothes. It makes it much easier to work with a director who understands what you're talking about, and he's got the most fantastic memory. So if you show him something, he'll remember it. I mean, I was really impressed when I show him reference pictures, and he could actually tell the difference between one year and the next. He'll go, oh yeah, that sleeve's a 1857 sleeve, and that's the sort of after 1860. It's quite incredible.
We had the idea that the gangs themselves, there were so many gangs down there, the colors they would wear, that they'd be able to see, one gang member be able to see another gang member coming down the street and he or she would know who they were and who they're affiliated with. For example, in the case of the dead rabbits, we knew that through research that they used red stripes. In some cases just down the side of the pants, another case across the shirt. Sandy Powell came up with the idea of doing the red stripes in a primitive way, doing it themselves with paint on whatever shirts they had available as a symbol. The Bowery Boys, much more elegant. They had stovepipe hats, red fire shirts, black frock coats, check pants or plaid pants, and long boots. And so and what they called soap locks. Their hair was matted down in a special kind of shiny, almost like what they used to call patent leather hair.
These people who have nothing, we think of dark and dreary and drab, and there's one thing that these people could have is color. It doesn't cost anything. Color is the wealth of these people. It's at a time, too, where there's a richness of cultures emerging together.
The difficult thing was just producing the amount of costumes that we had to cope with the numbers of people. It's phenomenally huge.
We alone, I think, have made something like 3,000 different costumes in our actual workshop, because that has also been the main factor, building things from scratch. And I'd say we have something like 7,000 costumes altogether.